What if I told you that there was a Formula One driver that didn't need two hands to drive? I know, it sounds crazy, but Robert Kubica could genuinely race F1 cars just with one hand. But that's not even the craziest part, because one day Robert suffered a tragic accident that will force him to turn this ability into his only option to survive. But how did he develop this unique skill, and what really happened to Robert Kubica? Well, to find out, we need to go back to 1984. Krakow, Poland. Here's where everything starts. If you were a kid growing up in Poland during the 80s, Formula One wasn't just a dream, it was practically a fantasy. While kids in wealthier countries raced on top-tier karting tracks with sponsors and shiny new gear, Robert was facing a different challenge altogether: poverty. His family didn't have much. Sometimes they couldn't even afford tyres, but none of that stopped him. Robert started racing very young. By the age of 10, he was humiliating kids who had professional coaching and top-tier machines. But the real turning point didn't come on a karting track. It came when Robert was just 13. Young Kubica packed up everything and moved from Poland to Italy to further his racing dream. But this wasn't some glamorous racing academy experience. The Polish teenager literally lived in the back of his karting team's warehouse, sleeping on a fold-out cot next to the tools and spare parts. But here's where it gets interesting. While other young racers were being pampered, Kubica was getting his hands dirty, learning every part of the machine beneath him. Therefore, he wasn't just driving a kart, he was feeling it in ways the others couldn't. But even with that kind of talent, most people still overlooked him. To them, Kubica was just another promising name that would eventually fade away, another underdog story that would end in disappointment. They were wrong. In 2003, the racing world finally got a real taste of Robert Kubica. He lined up against future Formula One stars like Nico Rosberg, Timo Glock and Christian Klein when he competed in Formula 3. That season, he went on to secure multiple podiums and a race win. By the end of the year, he had everyone talking. But he wasn't done. In 2005, he stepped up to the Formula Renault 3.5 series, the modern Formula 2. But again, Kubica didn't just survive it, he dominated it. 4 wins, 11 podiums, and he also won the championship title. He destroyed everyone. By now the message was clear. Kubica wasn't lucky, he wasn't just talented. But winning titles in junior formulas doesn't guarantee you a seat in Formula One. You need one golden opportunity, a single test day, to prove you're worth the risk. Therefore, when Renault called in December 2005, Kubica knew this was his only shot. And not just any affiliated Renault team, this was the official Renault F1 team. The reigning world champions that just ended Michael Schumacher and Ferrari's incredible dominance.
And Fernando Alonso wins, and he becomes the youngest man ever to win.
And now they were giving a chance to an almost unknown Polish driver. But Robert knew this was a one-off opportunity, and he stunned everyone. From the moment he left the pit lane, he looked like he belonged. His lap times were impressive, but it wasn't just that he was fast. He was like someone who had already raced at top levels. But sadly, Kubica didn't leave that test with a contract in his hand. F1 doesn't work that way. He had impressed, yes. However, Renault wasn't ready to make a move. But this wasn't the end, because that same day, other teams had been watching, and they quickly became curious too. Who was this guy? Where did he come from? And how the hell was he this good? And that's when everything started to change forever. BMW Sauber saw something special in Robert and gave him the break he needed. They'd already been watching Kubica's rise through the ranks and swooped him with an offer, a test driver role with a promise of races to come. And Kubica didn't have to wait long. Midway through the 2006 season, BMW Sauber's driver Jacques Villeneuve suffered an injury. The team needed a replacement, and they didn't have to look far. Kubica was given the nod, making his race debut at the Hungarian Grand Prix. Most rookies take time to find their feet, but Kubica didn't. In Hungary, during his debut, he looked like he was made for this. He even finished 7th, before getting disqualified for his car being slightly underweight. But that didn't matter. The paddock had seen enough. He was quick, calm, confident, and different. This wasn't a one-off.
Kubica, 9th place on his debut.
In fact, from that race, he became the official BMW Sauber driver, replacing world champion Jacques Villeneuve for the rest of the season. And this change paid off really well, because after just 2 races, Robert secured an incredible podium at Monza and other decent results near to the point-finish zone. However, by the next year, Kubica wasn't a rookie anymore. He was pushing the limits, edging closer to the front of the grid. But then came Canada 2007, where Robert Kubica's life took a dramatic turn. On lap 26, Kubica's car clipped another, skidded off and slammed head-on into a concrete barrier over 186 miles per hour. That's about 300 kilometers per hour. The impact was unreal. His car exploded into shards, flipped, flew and disintegrated. Everyone watching had the same thought.
Oh, he's got off! That Kubica hits the wall! It's a huge accident. And real concern on the BMW Sauber pit wall.
Nobody survives that. But somehow, Kubica did. He got out of the wreck with a sprained ankle and a mild concussion. That was it. A crash that looked like it should have ended everything didn't. And that survival didn't just earn him respect, it made him something else. He wasn't just a driver anymore. He was the guy who walked away from the impossible. Still, there was a question hanging over him. How do you come back from something like that? Most drivers would have played it safe after, but not Kubica. He returned after missing the following race and instantly drove faster, finishing his very first season 6th in the championship. This was surreal. But that's nothing, because in the following season, he showed the world what he was really capable of. Robert started 2008 as a champion. In the first 6 races, he scored 3 podiums, 2 4th places and 1 retirement. But it was at the next race in Canada, once again, that his story changed forever. You have to think that until that race, the championship standings showed Hamilton first, 38 points, Raikkonen second at 35 points, Massa third at 34 points, and Kubica fourth at just 32 points. Therefore, the Canadian GP was the perfect occasion. When F1 returned to Montreal, just 1 year after the fateful accident, all eyes were on him again. The hero needed his revenge. And he didn't just take it, he dominated and went on to win the race. In that moment, Canada flipped from the scene of a near-death crash to the place where Robert Kubica claimed his first Formula 1 victory.
This is where he had his enormous accident last year that many people thought might have killed him, but he bounced back. Robert Kubica wins in Canada. He takes the lead in the Drivers' World Championship.
It was the kind of comeback you'd expect in a movie, but this was real. That win changed everything. Suddenly, people started talking about how good Kubica was, and then the unexpected happened. Ferrari called. 2009 had been a disaster for them. Massa was recovering from a scary injury and Raikkonen wasn't delivering. Ferrari needed a new direction and Kubica was at the top of their list. And so talks began. The red suit, the dream seat, it was all within reach. He was this close to becoming Ferrari's next big thing. But it didn't happen. Kubica didn't sign, Ferrari didn't pull the trigger, and instead of joining the front-running Scuderia in 2010, he landed at Renault. Yes, they had history, but they weren't favourites. They weren't the winning team from just 5 years ago. Therefore, Kubica had every reason to fade into the midfield. But he didn't care. He wasn't there to play it safe. He was there to fight. And that year, he found a secret weapon, one that most drivers struggled with, but he somehow turned into an advantage. It was called the F-duct. And on paper, it sounded bizarre. A piece of technology built into the car's bodywork that lets the driver control airflow with their hand by covering a small hole in the cockpit. Basically, drivers needed to drive with one hand to go faster. Therefore, it turned races into multitasking nightmares. Most drivers hated it, but Kubica became a master of it. Somehow, he figured out how to drive one-handed without losing control. On street circuits like Singapore, where precision is everything, he was out there throwing the car into corners at impossible angles while adjusting the airflow with his elbow. It was ridiculous, and yet it worked. He started putting results out of a car that had no business fighting at the front. At Monaco, he qualified on the front row. At Spa, he was fighting with the Ferraris and McLarens like he was in the same league, when he absolutely wasn't. Race after race, he pushed that Renault into places it didn't belong. Kubica finished on the podium 3 times that year, placed top 5 more often than not, and ended the season 8th as one of the highest ranked midfield drivers on the grid. Oli Rosberg beat him due to 1 less retirement compared to Kubica, but Robert scored higher results. Statistically, he outperformed every other driver at his level, including Michael Schumacher. But 2010 wasn't just a showcase of what he could have done with a limited car. It was a warning and a reminder that if a team finally gave him a car worthy of his talent, he wouldn't have just won races, he'd have won championships. And that possibility was starting to feel closer than ever. Heading into 2011, Ferrari reignited their interest in Kubica, and they finally signed him for the 2012 season. He would drive for Renault for the 2011 season, and then in 2012 put on the red suit of Ferrari. The dream he'd carried since he was a kid was about to come true, and for once, it felt like Kubica wouldn't have to fight uphill every Sunday. He'd have the tools, he'd have the speed, he'd have everything he'd never had before. The pieces were finally falling into place. But sometimes, right when everything starts to align, everything falls apart. If there's one thing Robert Kubica loved, it was rallying. It kept him sharp in the off-season and gave him that raw, slippery feel for the car that brought out his best. So, like every year, even in 2011, he returned to compete in the Ronde d'Andorra rally. But halfway through one of the stages, the car snapped wide, too fast, too close to the edge. It slid, hit a patch of damp tarmac, and slammed into a steel guardrail. The crash was devastating. The rail didn't crumple, it pierced the car. It entered through the front and tore through the cockpit like a blade, straight through the chassis, straight through Kubica. His co-driver walked away with barely a scratch. But Kubica's right side took the full impact. Bones shattered, muscles torn open, nerves severed. But rescuers couldn't get him out of the crushed car quickly. It took an hour to get him out from the wreck. By the time he arrived at the hospital, the clock was ticking. The first surgery alone took 7 hours. And that was just the beginning. Over the next few years, he would go under the knife 17 more times. His entire right side, from shoulder to foot, was a wreck. His nerves were damaged. His hand couldn't grip, twist, or even feel properly. Once he was stable, the prognosis was clear. Kubica would never race in Formula 1 again. The doctor said he'd be lucky to even use his right hand again. Racing was out of the question. But the strange thing about Kubica was that even as everything fell apart, his love for racing never did. And yet somehow, 18 months after nearly bleeding out on the side of that mountain road, he got back into a rally car and shockingly, he won. That first event wasn't meant to be a victory. It was just a test. But he didn't just pass it, he proved to himself that the fire hadn't gone out. By 2013, his arm had made enough progress for him to sit in a simulator. That was something that would have been unthinkable just months before. But even though he could turn the wheel, there was one major issue. His wrist couldn't rotate enough to make the left-hand turns required in F1. Despite his right arm's limited mobility, Kubica adapted his driving technique, describing it as 70% left-handed and 30% right. He could drive, but not like he used to. So Kubica shifted his focus. Instead of pushing forward with F1, he turned to rallying. But after 3 seasons of rallying, the money dried up. The dream of F1 was starting to slip away again. Kubica never stopped believing in his return, but now the question was, would anyone else give him the chance? By 2016, the rhythm started to return. He tested different cars and dipped his toe into DTM and endurance racing. Nothing felt quite right, but in December, everything changed. A simulator session with Dallara lit a fuse. Suddenly, Formula 1 didn't feel like a fantasy anymore. It felt possible. But he couldn't just walk back into the paddock and demand a seat. So in June 2017, when Renault offered a one-off test in a 2012 car, it seemed like a kind gesture, just a bit of closure, a thank you and goodbye. But something strange happened. He was faster than their reserve driver. Therefore, another test followed a month later, this time at the circuit Paul Ricard. It wasn't as jaw-dropping, but it was solid. Renault hesitated, unsure whether to take the risk. Kubica knew time was running out, but the spark had been reignited. And just as it looked like the window might close again, Williams came calling. Williams offered another test. The signs were good. But then came Abu Dhabi, one final test to decide it all. Kubica was good, but another driver, Sergei Sirotkin, was slightly faster. Sirotkin was a young Russian driver backed by a big sponsorship deal from SMP Racing. He didn't have Kubica's experience, but he had money. And in F1, that can matter more than talent. Williams made the only decision they could afford to make. They gave the seat to Sirotkin. But Kubica didn't leave, he stayed on as a reserve, quietly kept testing, kept learning, waiting. And as 2018 unfolded, the pieces started shifting. Lawrence Stroll bought Force India and moved his son over. Sirotkin underperformed and couldn't bring in the same money again. Suddenly, Kubica didn't just make sense, he became the best option. Therefore, with a fresh deal and backing from Polish oil giant Orlen, Williams finally gave the call he had waited years to hear. He was back. A full-time Formula One driver, the grid had a comeback story like no other. But the fairy tale had a twist. The Williams car for 2019 was a disaster. It was the slowest on the grid, but there was still a fight in him, and in the end, he did the unthinkable. He finished the season with more points than his teammate George Russell, 1 point to 0. It was small, but it mattered. But reality caught up quickly. That 1 point couldn't erase the fact that Williams had fallen behind. The dream return was hurt by a car that simply couldn't compete. So, at the end of the season, Kubica stepped away from full-time racing, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Therefore, in 2020, he joined Alfa Romeo as a reserve. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept him active, and he still took part in FP1 sessions. And it was here that Kubica finally hung his gloves. His career hadn't ended in glory, trophies, or champagne, but it ended in something even more powerful: defiance. He had crashed, nearly died, and lost everything, but he came back. Not for money, not for fame, just to prove that he could, and he did. So, what do you think of Robert Kubica? Could he have been world champion? And talking about someone who had to prove people from a young age, I think you should discover how Michael Schumacher went from a broke kid with no chances to a Formula One legend.